There is a rock in the middle of Australia that isn't really a rock. Geologists say what you can see above the surface is only the very tip of it, the rest is buried, extending kilometres down into the earth, part of a formation stretching roughly 100 kilometres wide. Nearby, in the Northern Territory desert, there's a crater almost a kilometre across that sat in plain sight for tens of thousands of years before a single scientist ever documented it. In the hills north of Melbourne, a story about vanished schoolgirls became so deeply embedded in the public imagination that people still travel there today looking for evidence of a disappearance that never happened. And in a remote corner of Western Australia, a mountain range spanning hundreds of square kilometres stayed almost completely unknown to the outside world until less than 50 years ago. Australia's geology doesn't just look strange. It's some of the oldest exposed land on the planet, shaped by processes that go back billions of years in places, and in almost every case. The true story behind it is stranger, and more revealing than anything invented about it. These are 5 of the country's most bizarre rock formations, and what science and history actually say about each one. If you're new here, this channel is dedicated to Australia's hidden landscapes, its deep geological past, and the mysteries buried in both rock and record. If that's your kind of thing, subscribe now, there's a lot more where this came from. Start with the most famous rock in the country, because even here, most people only know a fraction of the story. Uluru rises 348 metres above the desert floor in the heart of the Northern Territory, taller than the Eiffel Tower, a single unbroken dome of red sandstone with a circumference of more than 9 kilometres. But the visible mountain is not the whole formation. Geologists describe Uluru as part of a huge, mostly underground series of rock formations roughly 100 kilometres wide and around 5 kilometres thick, with Uluru itself, the domes of Kata and Mount Connor the only pieces breaking the surface. Structurally, it behaves less like a boulder dropped onto the landscape and more like an iceberg. Almost all of its mass is hidden. Even the assumption that Uluru is the tallest thing out here is wrong. 40 kilometres to its west sit the 36 domes of Kata, and the tallest of those, Mount Olga, actually rises nearly 200 metres higher than Uluru itself. The story of how it got there begins an almost unimaginable length of time ago. Around 550 million years ago, a tectonic collision between what would become India and the west coast of Australia threw up a mountain range hundreds of kilometres long, built largely from granite. Because land plants hadn't evolved yet, those mountains were bare rock, exposed directly to wind and rain, and they eroded fast, cracking apart, tumbling into rivers, and grinding down into sand and gravel that eventually hardened into the Arkose sandstone that makes up Uluru today. What looks like a single, deliberate object is really the compressed evidence of an entire mountain range's destruction. Even the famous colour change at sunrise and sunset has a scientific cause rather than a mystical one. The surface is coated in oxidised iron. And as the angle and intensity of sunlight shifts through the day, that iron layer reflects the light differently, cycling the rock through shades of orange, deep red, and almost purple. To the Anangu, the traditional owners of this land, Uluru is not simply a geological curiosity, it's a living document of Chakirpa, the Anangu lore and creation history, with specific sites around its base, tied to specific ancestral beings and stories, some of which are only permitted to be told within the community itself. Long before anyone had a word for Arkose sandstone, the Anangu understood this place as sacred and treated it accordingly. That relationship is now formally recognised. Uluru Kata Chuta National Park was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1987 for its natural values, and again in 1994 for its cultural landscape, making it one of only a small number of sites on Earth to hold that dual listing. That understanding turned out to carry a very literal kind of wisdom too, for decades. Tourists climbed Uluru along a marked route to its summit, despite signs at the base and repeated requests from the Anangu not to, since the climb crosses a significant men's ceremonial pathway. Since the 1950s, at least 37 people have died attempting the climb, most from heart attacks brought on by the steep grade, the heat, and the exposure near the top. Between 2002 and 2009 alone, 74 climbers needed medical rescue. In 2017, the Uluru Kata National Park Board voted unanimously to close the climb permanently, and on the 26th of October 2019, it did a date chosen deliberately, marking the anniversary of the day the Australian government formally handed the title of the land back to the Anangu in 1985. The Anangu had been asking people not to climb this rock for cultural reasons for generations. It took nearly 4 decades and dozens of deaths for the rest of the world to treat that request as the safety warning it also happened to be. Now travel northwest to the edge of the Great Sandy Desert in Western Australia, roughly 150 kilometres south of Halls Creek. There's a nearly perfect circular depression carved into the earth, almost 900 metres across and deep enough that its floor sits around 60 metres below the surrounding plain. It's called Wolfe Creek Crater, and it is the scar left by one of the more violent events in Australia's recent geological history. At its widest point, the crater stretches close to 950 metres. And researchers estimate its walls originally plunged around 178 metres deep before thousands of years of windblown sand partially filled it in. The crater was formed roughly 120,000 years ago when an iron meteorite around 15 metres wide and weighing about 14,000 tonnes slammed into the desert at extraordinary speed, releasing energy equivalent to hundreds of thousands of tonnes of TNT. Because the surrounding region is so arid, wind and rain have barely touched the crater since, leaving its walls sharp and its circular shape almost undisturbed. It remains one of the best preserved impact craters anywhere on Earth, and one of the largest from which fragments of the actual meteorite have been recovered. Some of those fragments, weathered over tens of thousands of years, produced a nickel-iron mineral new to science entirely, later named Rievsite, after one of the men who identified the crater. Even today, the site is only reachable in the dry season, along a rough unsealed track branching off the remote Tanami Road. And that's the strange part. This isn't some hidden, invisible feature. It's nearly a kilometre wide, sitting in relatively open desert. Yet Western science didn't formally identify it until 1947, when geologists surveying the region for oil spotted it from the air during an aerial survey of the Canning Basin. A ground expedition followed 2 months later to confirm what they'd seen. For a crater of this size to go undocumented by outside science until the mid-20th century says less about the crater and more about how vast and unmapped this part of Australia still was. Because the Jaru and Walmajari peoples, whose country this is, had known about it for a very long time before that. They call it Kundimalal. And their dreaming stories describe how 2 rainbow serpents crossed the desert during creation time, forming nearby waterways as they moved, and how Kundimalal marks the place where one of them emerged from the ground. Different tellings describe a falling star, scorched by the crescent moon, exploding into the earth in a flash of light and thunder, passed down through generations in song and story, long before anyone attached the word meteorite to it. Whichever version you hear, the through line is the same. An object came down from the sky and struck this exact spot, remembered and retold with enough consistency that when scientists finally arrived with their instruments, they were simply catching up to something the local custodians had known about for millennia. One more thing worth clearing up while we're here. Some viewers will recognise the name Wolfe Creek from the 2005 horror film Wolfe Creek, which was marketed with the line based on true events and used the crater as a filming location. It's true that the film's killer was loosely inspired by real Australian crimes, the backpacker murders committed by Ivan Milat in the early 1990s, and the 2001 murder of British tourist Peter Falconio by Bradley Murdoch. Both men were real, both were convicted, and both cases are part of the public record. But the crater itself has no actual connection to either crime. The place is real. The murders that inspired the film happened hundreds of kilometres away, in different states, involving people who had nothing to do with this location. The horror movie borrowed a name and a landscape, nothing more. We're 2 down, 3 to go, and the next one might be the strangest story on this list. Not because of the rock itself, but because of what people have believed about it for almost 60 years. Stick around and subscribe if you want more of these. Head south now into Victoria. About 70 kilometres northwest of Melbourne, in the Macedon Ranges, on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri, Dja Dja Wurrung and Taungurung peoples, a jagged grey mass of volcanic rock rises 105 metres above the surrounding farmland. It's called Hanging Rock, and if the name sounds familiar even to people who've never been to Australia, there's a reason for that, but we'll come back to it. Geologically, Hanging Rock is what's known as a mamelon, a rare volcanic landform. It formed around 6.25 million years ago, when an unusually thick, soda-rich type of magma was forced up through a narrow vent and congealed on the surface, rather than flowing away like typical lava. As the mass cooled, it contracted and split into rough vertical columns. And over millions of years those columns weathered into the twisted spires and pinnacles you see today. The rock itself is a rare type called soda trachyte, and 2 smaller formations nearby, Camel's Hump and Crozier's Rocks, were created by the same volcanic activity around the same time. Together, the 3 mamelons form a small, exposed record of tectonic and volcanic forces that geologists still study today. None of that is why most people have heard of Hanging Rock, though. In 1967, Australian author Joan Lindsay published a novel called Picnic at Hanging Rock, about a group of schoolgirls and their teacher who climbed the rock during a Valentine's Day picnic in the year 1900 and simply vanish, with only one girl ever found. The foreword to the book stated that readers should decide for themselves whether the story was fact or fiction, and Lindsay spent the rest of her life declining to clarify. Following the acclaimed 1975 film adaptation, the ambiguity worked exactly as intended. The story is entirely fictional. There is no historical record of any such disappearance, and it has never happened. No schoolgirls went missing at Hanging Rock in 1900 or any other year. Lindsay herself attended a boarding school similar to the fictional Appleyard College, and had spent time around the rock as a young woman, which is likely where the setting came from, but the vanishing itself came from a dream she had in 1966, not from any documented event. And yet, decades later, tourists still arrive at Hanging Rock expecting to find some trace of a real tragedy, because the novel and film were written and shot with such conviction that the line between invention and history simply dissolved for a huge number of people. It's one of the cleanest examples in the country of how a good story can outrun the truth. The real Hanging Rock has no missing schoolgirls, no unexplained vanishing, no evidence of anything supernatural. What it does have is 6 million years of volcanic chemistry, a striking silhouette, one very convincing piece of fiction that a lot of people never stop believing, and somewhat more cheerfully, a long tradition as a genuine picnic spot, still hosting the annual Hanging Rock picnic races on New Year's Day and Australia Day. Now travel all the way back northwest, deep into the East Kimberley region of Western Australia. Hundreds of orange and grey striped domes rise out of the landscape like an enormous field of beehives, some over 200 metres tall, carved through with narrow gorges and slot canyons lined with Livistona palms. This is Purnululu, better known as the Bungle Bungle Range, and despite the park covering roughly 240,000 hectares in area, bigger than some small countries, it stayed almost entirely unknown to the wider world until shockingly recently. The domes are made of Devonian age sandstone, laid down more than 350 million years ago, and shaped by millions of years of erosion into what geologists call cone, cast one of the finest examples of that landform anywhere on Earth. But it's the stripes that make the Bungle Bungles instantly recognisable, and the explanation is closer to biology than geology. The dark grey-black bands are colonies of cyanobacteria, one of the oldest forms of life on the planet, growing on layers of rock that retain enough moisture to support them. The orange bands are simply the layers that dry out too fast for the cyanobacteria to survive, leaving the rock's natural iron oxide exposed instead. Every stripe on every dome is effectively a record of that layer's moisture history, repeated over and over across an entire mountain range. The Gija and Jaru peoples, the traditional custodians of this country, have lived alongside and known this landscape for tens of thousands of years, and it holds deep cultural significance, reflected in extensive rock art and burial sites across the range. Early cattle station workers in the area knew about the formations too, but because of how remote and difficult to access this part of the Kimberley is, the rest of the world had no idea the Bungle Bungle Range existed until the 1980s, when a television crew filming a documentary on the Kimberley region recorded it after being tipped off by a local pilot they happened to meet in an outback hotel bar. The footage aired in 1983, and within weeks, 4-wheel drive crews were making the difficult journey out to see it in person. The park was formally established in 1987, and by 2003, UNESCO had listed it as a World Heritage Site for its natural values. One of the most photographed landscapes in Australia today was less than 50 years ago, something almost nobody outside the local Aboriginal communities had ever laid eyes on. Back in the Northern Territory now, roughly 100 kilometres south of Tennant Creek, scattered across a wide, shallow desert valley, sit dozens of enormous red granite boulders, ranging from under a metre to more than 6 metres across, some stacked precariously atop one another. Some split cleanly in half as if struck by something enormous, some balanced in ways that seem to defy the idea that they've been sitting there, untouched, for longer than human history has existed. Early European settlers named the site Devil's Marbles, as though nothing but a supernatural hand could have arranged them this way. The real explanation is patient rather than dramatic. The granite here formed around 1.6 to 1.7 billion years ago, deep underground, as molten rock cooled slowly and crystallized. As that granite was gradually pushed upward and exposed at the surface, groundwater worked its way into cracks running through the rock, weathering it from the inside in layers, a process similar to how an onion peels. Softer, more weathered material fell away over millions of years, leaving behind the harder, rounder cores you see standing today. The boulders weren't placed. They're what remains after everything softer around them was worn away, and the desert climate here is extreme enough to still be actively reshaping them, with daytime temperatures that can exceed 40 degrees Celsius and nights that regularly drop below freezing. To the Warramungu, Kaiteti, Alyawara and Warpiri peoples, this site is Karlu Karlu, and it has been a significant ceremonial meeting place for an extraordinarily long time traditionally. All 4 groups gathered here for several weeks at a time to conduct ceremony together, and it is described by some researchers as one of the oldest continuously used religious sites on Earth. The reserve itself spans around 1,800 hectares of this valley, and in 2011 it was formally renamed Karlu Karlu /Devil's Marbles Conservation Reserve, reflecting a joint management arrangement between the traditional owners and park authorities. A number of dreaming stories are tied to this landscape. In the versions most often shared with visitors, the boulders are described as the eggs of the rainbow serpent. Other, more specific traditional accounts describe the ancestral being Arrange, whose twisted hair belt is said to have shed the strands that became the great red boulders as he travelled through and eventually returned to a nearby hill, where he is said to remain. As with many sacred sites, The full depth of these stories is knowledge held and shared within the communities themselves. What reaches the wider public is only ever a small piece of a much larger, living tradition. Put these 5 side by side, and a pattern starts to emerge that has nothing to do with aliens, curses, or anything supernatural. Uluru isn't a boulder. It's the last visible fragment of a mountain range that collided and collapsed over 500 million years ago. Wolfe Creek Crater isn't some hidden anomaly. It's a nearly kilometre-wide scar from the sky that modern science simply took a very long time to notice, despite the fact that the people living nearest to it had known about it for generations, and despite a horror film later borrowing its name for a story that never happened there. Hanging Rock isn't haunted. It's an extinct volcanic vent whose real mystery is entirely human. How a piece of fiction became so convincing that it replaced the historical record in the public imagination. Purnululu isn't new. It's ancient, and it was only ever hidden from people who weren't looking in the right place, or asking the people who already knew. And Karlu Karlu isn't the work of a devil. It's over 1 billion years of granite slowly shedding its outer layers, in a place 4 different peoples have gathered at for longer than most nations have existed. The actual pattern running through all 5 sites is this. In almost every case, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledge of these places predates the scientific discovery of them by tens of thousands of years, sometimes longer, and in almost every case, the popular story that spread furthest, whether a movie tagline or a piece of fiction mistaken for fact, was less accurate than the traditional knowledge that had been there all along. Science didn't uncover these landscapes. It arrived eventually at an understanding the traditional custodians had already reached, just using a different set of tools and a very different sense of time. It's also worth sitting with how differently these 2 knowledge systems arrived at their conclusions. Western science needed satellites, aerial surveys, isotope dating, and in some cases nearly a century of tools that simply didn't exist before 1900. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledge systems held the same core truths for tens of thousands of years through observation, oral tradition, and lived relationship with the land, passed down with enough accuracy to still line up with what modern instruments eventually confirmed. Neither replaces the other. But it's hard to look at 5 sites in a row where that pattern holds and call it a coincidence. Australia's landscape doesn't need embellishment to be strange. 500 million years of tectonic collision, a meteorite strike, a novel powerful enough to rewrite public memory, a mountain range hidden from the modern world until the 1980s, and over 1 billion years of granite erosion are already stranger than anything invented about them. The truth just takes longer to explain than a legend does. Which of these 5 formations did you find the most unbelievable? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more of Australia's real geological and historical mysteries, subscribe. There's a lot more still buried out there.